Welcome back. So before we dive into the somewhat splashier topic of charts, let's explore a more straightforward, yet often equally effective, visualization tool for helping us better understand our data: conditional formatting. Conditional formatting, as the name implies, allows us to apply different formatting to different cells of our pivot table, depending on the values they contain. While we can make the custom formatting applied to pivot table cells as specific as we want, and based on as many logical conditions as we want, for starters, we'll look at some conditional formatting options that come more or less pre-packaged and ready to use. First up is data bars. So data bars are terrific for giving scale to a particular measure's numbers in a pivot. The largest number gets the biggest bar, the smallest number gets the smallest bar. You get the idea. Now, you may already be familiar with data bars if you've done a lot of work with Excelll in the past, but adding them to pivot tables works just a bit differently than with standard Excelll ranges. Let's see how. So here in our example file, we have a simple pivot table with state on rows and order count on values. So let's say we want to add some sense of scale and proportionality to the values in our order count column, so we can easily identify the states that had the most orders. So data bars are a great way to do that. To use them, we'll first select any cell in our order count column, and then on the Home tab of the Excelll ribbon, we'll click the Conditional Formatting button, and then hover over Data Bars. And as you can see, we're given a number of pre-configured options for how those data bars might look. And if we just hover over those, we'll actually get a preview of what that data bar would look like applied to our selected cell. I personally prefer the gradient fills, and I'm partial to the color blue, so I'll select our blue data bar. And while this looks kind of pretty, it's not really doing a lot of useful work for us at the moment. The whole point here was to visually clarify where each value fits in relative to the others, but we've only highlighted a single cell. So to change that, let's click this little contextual icon that popped up right next to our cell that has our data bar. And now we'll see that we have the option to apply that formatting to just the selected cells, which is what we're doing now, or all cells showing order count values, or all cells showing order count values for name. Well, first let's try all cells showing order count values. Now this is kind of weird. We're getting a series of incredibly short bars for all of our states no matter how many orders they had. But if we scroll all the way to the bottom, we see the problem. Our biggest value by far is our grand total, which kind of makes sense. So compared to our grand total, even the total for a state that had lots of orders is going to look kind of puny, hence the small data bar associated with that state. So clearly we need to modify this once again. So to do that, we just click again any of the cells in our column that we're applying conditional formatting to, and then hit our conditional formatting button again, and then choose Manage Rules. And now we get a list of all the conditional formatting rules we've applied to this cell. Obviously we've only done one thus far. So let's select this and then hit Edit. And now at the very top of this dialog box, we see those same three options for which cells we want to apply the rule to. And what we want to do is apply it to all cells showing an order count value for name. So obviously our grand total isn't broken out by the state name, but all these other cells are. So what we're really saying here is, don't include our grand total as one of the values that we're comparing to all the others. So now if we click OK, and then Apply, and then OK, now we see our data bars are working exactly as we would expect. States with a lot of orders, like New Jersey and New York, have very long data bars, whereas states with just a few orders, like Idaho, have a short data bar. Now you might be wondering how this sort of visualization would work in a slightly more complicated pivot table layout. Well, let's see. Let's add region as another layer to our row labels. So I'll scroll down to our regions table in my pivot table field list and then just drag in region name. And what we see here is that we have data bars for our state values, but we don't have them for our regions. So if we want to apply data bars to the regions level of our pivot table as well, first of all, we'll need to have subtotals in our pivot table so we have numbers to compare against each other. So I'll go to the Design Contextual tab for our pivot, and then go under Subtotals, and then select Show All Subtotals at Top of Group. So now we actually have numbers that we can compare to the numbers for the other regions. Then, to actually put data bars on these numbers, we'll need to select one of them that is directly adjacent to a row label for region and not state. So I'll choose cell C2 here that has our number for the East North Central region. And then I'll just follow the familiar steps. Go to our Home tab, Conditional Formatting, Data Bars, and perhaps to offset the visualization for region versus state, I'll use a slightly different color, maybe red. So I'll choose that, and then I'll click our little button here and apply our formatting to all cells showing order count values for name, where name in this case is region name and not state name. And now, just like we had for state, we get a visual sense of scale for the order counts for all of our respective regions. Pretty cool. Now sometimes, instead of simply applying scale to the numbers in our pivot, we want to assign additional meaning to each number by slotting it in on a continuum somewhere between good and bad. Two effective ways of going about this are color scales and icon sets. Let's take a look at color scales first. So color scales use color to call out where the numbers in our pivot tables fit in on a scale from bad to good. Now this requires us to define a good color and a bad color, as well as defining precisely what good versus bad even is. For example, sometimes a bigger number may be good, as with revenue or profit, but it may also be bad, like with customer calls abandoned. Now this may sound like a lot of work, but fortunately Excelll makes it easy. Now first, just so we have a different metric to apply our conditional formatting to, I'll create a whole new measure called orders within SLA percentage. And this will basically just say, for any given set of coordinates in our pivot table, what percentage of orders were shipped within our SLA. So real quick, I'll go to our Power Pivot tab, Measures, New Measure. I'll assign to the Orders table, and I'll call our measure again, Orders % within SLA. And then our measure is going to be super simple. It's just going to be the average of our within SLA field in our orders table. And then we're going to format that as a percentage. And then we'll click OK. And now we have our new measure in our pivot. So now to apply color scales to our new measure, I'll just make sure I've got any cell in that column with our measure selected, and then again hit our conditional formatting button. And now I'll hover over the color scales option, which again allows us to preview a series of different color palettes. So since our measure is one that would be considered to be performing better if it's a bigger number and worse if it's a smaller number, it makes sense to choose a color scale where there's a color associated with negative performance at the lower end and better performance at the higher end. Now in the analytics world, quite commonly, warm colors, especially reds, are associated with negative performance, and cool colors, especially greens, are associated with positive performance. So I think I'll select this very first one, and then click this button so we can make sure our conditional formatting rule is applied to all cells at this level of hierarchy in our pivot, that being region, other than the grand total. So I'll say all cells showing orders % with an SLA values for name. And now as we scroll down, we see that our very low % with an SLA for East North Central is colored red, and most of our other values are yellow, but our very highest values are either green or a shade of green. And then we can do the same operation for the state level of hierarchy in our pivot. So we'll select one of those cells, and then color scales, and we'll pick that very first scale, and then we'll make sure that's applied to all the states. And again, scrolling down, we'll see that the states that performed best, that had the highest SLA, get the greenest color, and the states that performed worst get the reddest color, and all the other states are somewhere in between. Now, sometimes a simple scale doesn't provide enough nuance to call out important aspects of our data. It's often the case that our metrics have important thresholds, or cutoff points, above or below which their performance is considered to be significantly better or worse. For example, let's say that for our within SLA percentage metric here, anything 90% and above is considered good, anything 75% and above is considered acceptable, and anything less than 75% is considered poor. In a case like this, the thresholds are very important, but we don't care all that much about how numbers vary between the thresholds. For situations like this, icon sets are the smart play. So let me show you how we can use them to add a little more meaning to our within SLA percentage metric. So the first step is to edit our existing conditional formatting rule for percent with an SLA. So I'll hit our conditional formatting button and then choose Manage Rules. And you can see that we actually have two rules with color scales because we're applying those rules to different levels of hierarchy within our pivot. So I'll select the one for states first and choose Edit. And now at the bottom of the dialog box, you can see that we're currently applying a 3-color scale conditional format. So to change that to an icon set, I just click this drop down and choose Icon Sets. And now we get a whole different set of options. First of all, we can choose different styles of icons to use. So right now we have essentially traffic lights as our icons. But if we click this drop down, we see that we can employ flags, a different style of traffic light, or one of my personal favorites, a red X, a yellow exclamation mark or warning sign, and a green check mark. So I think I'll actually opt for that one. And now below that, we get to specify the exact thresholds at which we use each of these icons. So again, instead of showing a potentially infinite number of shades of color depending on our numbers, each value in our column is going to get one of these 3 icons depending on where that value fits in on the ranges that we specify. So going back to our original specifications, we consider 90% and above to be good performance. So when our value here is greater than or equal to 90, we want to return this green check mark. Now, one thing I'll caution you against here when using icon sets is using a type of percent, even if your measure is a percentage. I have found that particular feature to be buggy and unreliable, so I'd say instead use number, and then for your value, just use the actual numerical value of that percentage, which in the case of 90% is just 0.9. And now for our next threshold, if our value is 75% or 0.75 or above, then we want to return that warning sign, that yellow exclamation mark. So first we'll change the type to number, and then change that number to 0.75. So now, by default, when that number is not greater than or equal to 75%, we want to return this red X. So this looks like it should be good to go, so we'll click OK. And then we'll hit Apply. And just a brief scan of the cells in that percent with an SLA column shows that it appears our conditional formatting is working. But before we click out of this dialog box, I'll also change the conditional formatting rule we've applied to region in our pivot and pretty much do it the same way. We'll go for icon set, and we'll change that to our X exclamation mark and check mark. And then for our thresholds, we'll choose 0.9 and 0.75, and then click OK and Apply. And now we can click OK again. And now rolling down, we see that we have, honestly, precious few good performing states, quite a few middling ones, and just a handful of bad ones. But the bigger picture is our conditional formatting rule is working exactly as we intended. All right. Now that we've seen how much we can accomplish with the pre-packaged conditional formatting options Excelll gives us, it's time to learn how to create our own custom conditional formats and conditional formatting criteria to give us even more control over the story we tell with our data. That's up next. I'll see you then.